What happens when a millionaire art dealer gets stranded during a deadly tide surge and is rescued by a lonely lighthouse keeper? Margaret Hale thought she was just selling her last vacation home, but a freak storm changed everything. Trapped on a remote island with Thomas Reed and his teenage daughter, she discovered that some rescues go deeper than just being pulled from rising water. This is a story about two souls who thought their lives were over, finding that sometimes the most beautiful chapters begin when you think the book has already ended. If you love stories about second chances, unexpected connections, and the courage to start over after loss, you're going to love this journey. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more heartwarming stories that prove it's never too late for love. I'm not good at starting over. Art CEO's life changed when Lighthouse Keeper saved her. The fog rolled in like a living thing, thick fingers reaching across the New England coastline as Margaret Hale navigated the winding road toward Beacon Point. Her silver BMW cut through the mist headlights, barely penetrating the gray wall that seemed to close in around her with each passing mile. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her manicured fingers drumming against the leather. 53 years old, and this was how she spent her Tuesday driving to the middle of nowhere to sell the last piece of her old life. The vacation home at Beacon Point had been Richard's idea back when they'd thought they had forever to fill it with memories. That was before the mountain claimed him. 5 years now, and she still caught herself setting 2 coffee cups in the morning. The radio crackled with static breaking through her thoughts. Unusual high tide warning for coastal areas, advised to avoid low-lying roads. Margaret reached over to adjust the volume, but the signal faded into white noise. She clicked it off with an irritated sigh. Weather warnings were for people who didn't have places to be, deadlines to meet, lives to organize with military precision. The road curved sharply, hugging the rocky coastline. Through breaks in the point, she caught glimpses of dark water unusually high and restless. The tide was coming in faster than she remembered from previous visits. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A text from her assistant. Buyers confirmed for 3 p.m. Documents ready for signature. 3 o'clock. That gave her 2 hours to walk through the house one last time to pack up the remaining photos and the bottle of wine Richard had been saving for their 25th anniversary. Simple enough. The road dipped suddenly, and Margaret felt her stomach drop with it. The asphalt here was older, cracked from years of salt air and harsh winters. Puddles reflected her headlights, but these weren't from rain. They were from the encroaching sea. She slowed the car, unease creeping up her spine. The water was definitely higher than normal, lapping at the edges of the road with each wave. Through the windshield, she could see the narrow causeway that led to the small island where the vacation house sat, or where it used to sit above the waterline. The causeway was gone. Not damaged, gone. Completely submerged beneath churning gray water that moved with unnatural urgency. Margaret pulled the car to a stop at the edge of what had once been solid ground. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for her phone, but there was no signal. The fog had swallowed everything: the road behind her, the island ahead, even the sound of her own heartbeat beneath the roar of the approaching tide. She stepped out of the car, her Italian leather shoes squelching in the wet sand that had somehow appeared where pavement should be. The wind hit her immediately, salt-sharp and surprisingly cold for October. It whipped her carefully styled auburn hair across her face, and she pushed it back with trembling fingers. This wasn't right. She'd driven this route dozens of times over the years. The causeway was always passable even at high tide. But now the water was rising faster than seemed possible, reaching hungrily toward her car. Panic fluttered in her chest, a sensation she hadn't felt since the hospital called about Richard's accident. Margaret Hale didn't panic. She solved problems. She made decisions. She controlled outcomes. But she couldn't control the tide. The water reached her feet, soaking through her expensive shoes and shocking her into action. She stumbled backward toward the car, but even as she did, she could see it was too late. The road behind her was disappearing beneath the surge. "Help!" she called out, her voice swallowed by the wind and fog. "Someone help me!" Only the sea answered, rushing closer with each heartbeat. Margaret climbed onto the roof of her car, her business suit completely impractical for this nightmare scenario. The metal was slippery beneath her, and she fought to maintain her balance as waves began to lap at the vehicle's wheels. Through the bogs, something flickered. A light, warm and steady, cutting through the gray like a beacon. A lighthouse. Of course she remembered now. The old beacon point light automated decades ago, but still functioning. Its beams swept across the water in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, and for the first time since stepping out of her car, Margaret felt a spark of hope. If there was a lighthouse, there might be people. Someone who could help her, who understood tides and boats, and how to navigate this aquatic maze that had swallowed her neat, organized world. The light swept over her, again paused, then returned to focus directly on her position. Someone had seen her. Someone knew she was in trouble. Margaret waved her arms frantically, her usual composure completely abandoned. Here, I'm here. The beam held steady on her for a long moment, then began to sweep again, but differently now, as if guiding something through the water. She strained her ears and thought she heard it, the sound of oars cutting through waves, steady and purposeful. A small boat emerged from the fog like something from a maritime painting. At the oars sat a man in a yellow rain slicker, his movements economical and sure, despite the rough water. He was older, perhaps her age, with graying hair plastered to his head by the spray. "Don't move," he called out as he maneuvered the boat closer to her car. The water's still rising. His voice was deep calm with the flat vowels of a lifelong New Englander. Margaret felt something in her chest unclench at the authority in his tone. This was someone who knew what he was doing. "I can't swim very well," she admitted as the boat bumped against her car's bumper. "Won't need to." He shipped the oars and reached out a weathered hand. "Step down slowly, I've got you." Margaret looked at the gap between the car roof and the boat, easily 3 feet of dark, churning water. Every instinct screamed against trusting this stranger, against leaving the relative safety of her car for a small boat in increasingly rough seas. But her car was sinking. The water was now halfway up the doors, and the vehicle listed ominously to one side. "Trust me," the man said, reading her hesitation. "I've been running boats in these waters for 30 years. Storm caught you off guard, but it caught me ready." Something in his voice, the quiet confidence, the lack of dramatics, convinced her. Margaret had built a multi-million-dollar art business by learning to read people, and this man radiated competence the way her car radiated luxury. She reached out and grasped his hand. His palm was calloused and sure, and when he pulled, she found herself stepping down into the boat with surprising grace. He steadied her as the small craft rocked, then immediately returned to the oars. "Sit in the stern," he instructed. "Keep your head down when we hit the chop." Margaret settled onto the narrow bench, watching as he guided them away from her drowning BM. "My car. Insurance problem now," he said matter-of-factly. "Tide'll peak in about an hour, then start dropping. Your car might surface by tomorrow, might not. Either way, not much to be done about it tonight." She watched her BMW disappear beneath the waves, taking with it her purse, her phone, her carefully planned schedule. Everything that connected her to her organized life on the mainland was now underwater. "Thank you," she said, surprised by how small her voice sounded. "I'm Margaret Hale." He glanced over his shoulder as he pulled against the current. "Thomas Reed. And you're welcome, though. I'd save the thanks until we're on dry ground." The boat moved steadily through the fog, Thomas navigating by instinct, and the lighthouse beam that continued to sweep overhead. Margaret found herself studying his profile, the strong jaw, the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into sun and spray. He was handsome in a weathered way that her Boston social circle would never understand or appreciate. "Do you live out here?" she asked, needing to fill the silence. "At the lighthouse? Been the keeper there for 15 years, even after they automated it. Someone needs to maintain the equipment, monitor the radio." He pulled harder against a cross-current. "Someone needs to be there when city folks get caught by surprise tides." There was no judgment in his voice, but Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks anyway. "I've driven that road dozens of times. The causeway was never." "Spring tide," Thomas said simply. "Happens twice a month when the moon's right. Usually not this high, but the storm's surge pushed it over the mark. Weather Service probably issued warnings, but reception's spotty out here." They were approaching the lighthouse now, its white tower emerging from the fog like a monument to permanence. At its base, Margaret could see a small house with warm light glowing in the windows. After the gray chaos of the water, it looked impossibly welcoming. Thomas guided the boat to a small dock and tied off with practiced efficiency. "Can you manage the ladder?" Margaret looked at the wooden rungs leading up to the dock, slick with spray and seaweed. In her business suit and ruined heels, it might as well have been Mount Everest. But the alternative was staying in the boat and she'd had enough of floating for one day. I can manage. She could barely. Thomas steadied the boat as she climbed, then followed with her oars and a small bag she hadn't noticed him pack. On the dock, she felt the solid ground beneath her feet with profound relief. The lighthouse house was larger than it had appeared from the water, 2 stories of weathered shingle siding, with windows that glowed warmly in the gathering dusk. A narrow path led from the dock to the front door, bordered by hardy beach grass that bent but didn't break in the wind. "Hope you don't mind simple accommodations," Thomas said as he led her up the path. "Not exactly what you're probably used to." Margaret was about to respond when the front door opened, revealing a teenager with Thomas's strong jaw and suspicious eyes. The girl was perhaps 16, with long brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of guarded expression that spoke of too much early responsibility. "Dad," the girl's voice carried a note of concern. "The tide warning came through on the radio. I saw you take the boat out." "Found someone who needed help," Thomas said simply. "Emma, this is Margaret. She'll be staying until the causeway clears." Emma's gaze swept over Margaret's expensive but now ruined outfit, taking in every detail with the merciless assessment only teenagers could manage. "How long will that be?" "Day or two, depending on how much damage the storm does," Thomas replied, climbing the steps to the front door. "We'll set her up in the spare room." Margaret felt like an imposition and intrusion into this father-daughter sanctuary. "I don't want to impose. Isn't there a hotel nearby, or nearest hotel's 20 miles inland?" Emma said. "And the road you came in on, it's going to be underwater for at least 12 hours longer if the storm gets worse." The girl wasn't being unkind, just stating facts with the same practical directness as her father. Margaret realized she had no choice but to accept their hospitality, no matter how uncomfortable it made her. Thomas held the door open. "Emma's right. You're stuck with us until the water goes down. Might as well come in where it's warm." The interior of the lighthouse house surprised Margaret. She'd expected something Spartan nautical in the extreme. Instead, she found herself in a living room that was comfortable without being fancy overstuffed furniture that looked actually used bookshelves lined with everything from maritime histories to paperback novels, a stone fireplace with a small fire crackling behind a screen. It felt like a home, not a showcase, not a statement, just a place where people lived and cared for each other. Margaret couldn't remember the last time she'd been in such a space. "I'll get you some dry clothes," Emma said, already heading toward the stairs. "You look about my size, maybe a little bigger." "That's very kind of you," Margaret began, but the girl was already gone, leaving her alone with Thomas in the warm light of his living room. He was studying her with the same careful assessment she'd seen in his daughter's eyes, but without the teenage edge. "You hurt anywhere? Sometimes people don't realize they've been knocked around until the adrenaline wears off." Margaret took inventory. Her feet ached from the ruined shoes her hands were scraped from gripping the car roof, and she was fairly certain she'd have bruises on her legs from climbing into the boat. But nothing serious, nothing that wouldn't heal. "I'm fine, just shaken up. I've never been in a situation like that before." Thomas nodded. "Most people haven't. The sea doesn't give much warning when it decides to change the rules." He gestured toward the sofa. "Sit down before you fall down. You've had enough excitement for one day." Margaret sank onto the couch, surprised by how exhausted she suddenly felt. The adrenaline was indeed wearing off, leaving her feeling hollowed out and strangely fragile. She looked around the room, taking in details she'd missed before: photos of Emma, at various ages, always with Thomas, never with another adult. A chess set with a game in progress on a side table. A telescope pointed toward one of the windows. "Your wife doesn't mind unexpected guests?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw Thomas's expression shift. "My wife died when Emma was born," he said quietly. "It's just been the two of us for 16 years. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "No harm done." Thomas moved to the fireplace, prodding the logs with unnecessary attention. "What about you, husband? Wondering where you are?" Margaret's turned to feel the sharp edge of memory. "My husband died 5 years ago. Mountain climbing accident." The words came easier now than they used to, but they still carried weight. Thomas looked up from the fire, and for a moment their eyes met with perfect understanding. They were both members of the same unwanted club people who'd learned to navigate life alone after planning to navigate it with someone else. Emma's footsteps on the stairs broke the moment. The girl appeared with an armload of closed jeans, a flannel shirt, thick socks. "These should fit." There's towels in the bathroom upstairs, first door on the right. Thank you. Margaret took the clothes, surprised by the kindness. I'll, I'll find a way to replace these if anything gets ruined. Emma shrugged. They're just clothes. You can pay me back by not dripping on the good furniture. Margaret almost smiled at that. The girl had her father's directness, but with a teenage bite that was somehow refreshing after years of polite social interactions that said nothing and meant less. Go get changed, Thomas said. We'll figure out dinner once you're dry. Upstairs, Margaret found the bathroom to be small but spotlessly clean, with a window that looked out over the water. She could hear the waves breaking against the rocks below, a sound that would have terrified her an hour ago, but now seemed oddly comforting. She caught sight of herself in the mirror and winced. Her carefully applied makeup was gone, her expensive salon highlights hung in limp waves, and her business suit looked like something dragged from a shipwreck, which she supposed it essentially was. For the first time in 5 years, Margaret Hale looked like someone who needed rescuing, someone vulnerable, someone whose control over her circumstances had been completely stripped away. It should have terrified her. Instead, as she peeled off her ruined clothes and reached for Emma's simple practical garments, she felt something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. She felt relief. Downstairs, she could hear Thomas and Emma moving around the kitchen, their voices low and comfortable with the rhythm of people who'd shared the same space for years. The smell of something cooking, soup maybe, or stew, drifted up the stairs, and Margaret's stomach reminded her that she'd skipped lunch in her hurry to get to the house sale. She dressed in Emma's borrowed clothes, surprised by how good the soft denim and worn flannel felt against her skin. When was the last time she'd worn jeans? When was the last time she'd worn anything that wasn't carefully chosen to project success and control? Margaret made her way back downstairs, following the sounds and smells toward the kitchen. She found Thomas at the stove stirring something in a large pot while Emma set the table for 3. Feel better? Thomas asked without turning around. Much thank you. Margaret hesitated in the doorway, feeling like an intruder again. Can I help with anything? Sit, Emma commanded, pointing to one of the chairs. Dad's got a thing about people messing with his cooking. Thomas glanced over his shoulder with a slight smile. I learned to cook when Emma was little. Now she won't let me forget it. He makes really good clam chowder, Emma added, warming slightly. Got the recipe from his grandmother. Margaret sat where directed, watching as father and daughter moved around each other with the easy choreography of long practice. There was affection here, she realized, not the demonstrative kind, but the steady, reliable sort that showed in small gestures and comfortable silences. It made her chest ache with something she couldn't quite name. Thomas ladled chowder into 3 bowls and brought them to the table along with a plate of crusty bread and butter. The soup was indeed excellent, rich and creamy, with tender clams and the kind of depth that came from simmering all day. This is wonderful, Margaret said after her first spoonful. Thank you for taking me in. I know this wasn't how you planned to spend your evening. We don't get many visitors, Emma said, especially not ones who need rescuing from their cars. Emma, there was gentle warning in Thomas's voice. What? It's true, the last person who got stranded here was that guy from Portland who didn't check the tide charts before trying to reach the island. That was, 3 years ago? 2 years, Thomas corrected. And he had the sense to wade on high ground instead of climbing on his car roof. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. I panicked. Not exactly my finest moment. Panic's natural when the world suddenly turns underwater, Thomas said matter-of-factly. Most people don't know how to read the signs. The sea doesn't announce its intentions. Do you ever get scared out here? Margaret asked Emma. Living so isolated with just the 2 of you. Emma considered the question seriously. Not scared exactly, but sometimes I wonder what it would be like to live somewhere with more people, to have neighbors, to go to a school where I actually know some of my classmates outside of class. Thomas's spoon paused halfway to his mouth, and Margaret caught something that passed between father and daughter, a conversation they'd had before perhaps many times. You go to school on the mainland, Margaret asked. Online mostly, Emma said. I go into town for some classes, but it's a long trip, especially in winter when the weather's bad. Margaret looked around the kitchen again, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just isolation, it was dedication. Thomas had chosen to raise his daughter in this remote place, cut off from the rhythms of modern life. It must have been incredibly difficult, especially as a single father. "Why do you stay?" she asked Thomas. "With the lighthouse automated, you could live anywhere." Thomas set down his spoon and looked out the window toward the water. "Someone needs to maintain the equipment, monitor the radio frequencies, keep an eye on things." He paused. "And this is Emma's home, has been since she was born." But Emma was watching her father with an expression Margaret was beginning to recognize, the look of a teenager who was starting to understand the sacrifices that had been made for her and who wasn't entirely sure she wanted that responsibility. "Emma's applying to colleges," Thomas continued. "She'll be leaving for school next year." "Where are you thinking of applying?" Margaret asked. "Maine Maritime Academy," Emma said immediately. "Marine biology program. I want to study ocean conservation." "That's wonderful. Your father must be proud." "He is," Emma said, but her gaze drifted to Thomas, who was staring into his chowder as if it held secrets. "But he's also going to be here by himself for the first time in, well, forever." The silence that followed was weighted with unspoken concerns. Margaret understood suddenly why Emma had looked so suspicious when Thomas brought home a stranger. This family of two was facing a transition, and change was always threatening to systems that had found their balance. "Have you ever thought about what you'll do when Emma leaves?" Margaret asked gently. Thomas looked up, and she saw something in his eyes, not fear exactly, but a kind of resignation. "Keep the light running, keep an eye on the water, same as always." But Emma made a soft sound of frustration. "Dad, you can't just stay out here forever alone. What happens when you get older? What happens if something goes wrong and there's no one around to help?" "I'll manage," Thomas said, the same way he'd said everything else, with quiet certainty that brooked no argument. Margaret recognized the dynamic. She'd seen it in her own life in different forms. Thomas was a man who'd built his identity around taking care of others, around being needed. The idea of Emma leaving wasn't just about loneliness, it was about purpose. What was a lighthouse keeper without someone to protect? Thunder rolled across the water, and rain began to hit the windows with increasing force. The storm was intensifying, which meant Margaret would be staying longer than any of them had originally thought. "Sounds like it's getting worse out there," Thomas observed. Emma checked her phone. "Weather service is saying the storm might last through tomorrow. The causeway won't be passable until at least Thursday." Thursday, Margaret felt a strange mix of anxiety and something else, something that might have been relief. Her carefully scheduled life was completely derailed, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it except surrender to the circumstances. "I should call my assistant," she said. "Let her know I won't make the appointment." "Do you have a phone I could use?" "Landline's in the living room," Thomas said, "though with this weather the connection might be sketchy." Margaret tried the call, but as Thomas had predicted, the line was full of static and kept cutting out. She managed to leave a brief message with her assistant's voicemail, explaining that she'd been delayed by weather and would reschedule, but the specifics were lost in the crackling connection. When she returned to the kitchen, Thomas was clearing the dinner dishes while Emma worked on homework at the table calculus, from what Margaret could see over her shoulder. "Need any help with that?" Margaret asked. Emma looked up surprised. "You know calculus. I have an MBA from Wharton. I know enough to be dangerous." Margaret sat back down at the table. "What's the problem?" Emma had turned her laptop screen toward Margaret, showing a series of integration problems that looked familiar despite the years that had passed since Margaret had tackled similar equations. For the next hour, Margaret found herself tutoring Emma through the homework, surprised by how much she enjoyed the process. The girl was sharp, quick to grasp concepts, and unafraid to ask questions. It reminded Margaret of her younger self, hungry for knowledge and determined to master whatever came her way. Thomas finished the dishes and joined them at the table, watching his daughter work through the problems with Margaret's guidance. "You're good at this," he said, when Emma successfully solved a particularly tricky problem. "I like teaching." Margaret realized the words surprising her as she said them. "I'd forgotten that." "You teach?" Emma asked. "Not formally, but in my business, I owned art galleries. I spent a lot of time educating clients about pieces, helping them understand what they were looking at, why it mattered." Margaret watched Emma tackle the next problem. "It's not so different from this, really. Breaking down something complex into manageable parts." "What kind of art?" Thomas asked. "Contemporary mostly. Some classical pieces. I specialized in helping new collectors build their first serious collections." She paused, remembering. "I sold the business last year." Why? Emma asked, looking up from her laptop. It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Margaret had told herself it was about diversifying her investments, about having more flexibility in her life. But sitting in this warm kitchen, watching this father and daughter navigate their own transitions, she felt the truth rise to the surface. I lost my passion for it, she admitted. After my husband died, everything felt different. The art was the same, the clients were the same, but I couldn't find the joy in it anymore. It felt like I was going through the motions. Thomas nodded with the understanding of someone who'd wrestled with similar feelings. Sometimes grief changes the shape of everything, even the things we used to love. Outside, the wind howled around the lighthouse, and Margaret could hear waves crashing against the rocks with increasing violence. The storm was at its peak now, turning the world beyond these walls into chaos. But inside, surrounded by the warm light and quiet conversations, she felt safer than she had in months. Emma finished her homework and closed her laptop. I'm going to read for a while before bed. Thanks for the help with calc. You're welcome. Anytime. Emma headed for the stairs, then turned back. Are you going to be okay sleeping in the spare room? It's pretty basic, just a bed and a dresser. Not what you're probably used to. Margaret smiled at the girl's awkward kindness. I'll be fine. Thank you for the clothes. When Emma was gone, Thomas moved to the window, checking the storm's progress. Margaret joined him, looking out at the lighthouse beam, cutting through the rain and darkness. How often do storms like this come through? She asked. Few times a year, usually. This one's a bit stronger than normal, but nothing we can't handle. Thomas's voice carried the confidence of long experience. The lighthouse was built to last. It's weathered storms a lot worse than this. And you've been here through all of them. Most of them. Started as assistant keeper when I was 25. Took over full responsibility when the old keeper retired. Thomas glanced at her. What about you? You ever weather storms like this in your life? Margaret considered the question. I thought I was good at handling crises, building the business, dealing with difficult clients, navigating the art world politics. But when Richard died, she trailed off, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the dark water. I realized there's a difference between handling problems you can solve and handling problems that just have to be survived. Grief's like that, Thomas said quietly. It's not a problem to solve, it's weather to get through. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the storm rage beyond the safety of the lighthouse walls. Margaret found herself studying Thomas's profile again, the strength in his weathered features, the patience that seemed to radiate from him like warmth from the fireplace. When was the last time she'd stood quietly with someone, not needing to fill the silence with business talk or social pleasantries? When was the last time she'd felt this kind of peace? I should let you get some rest, Thomas said eventually. Tomorrow's going to be a long day if this storm keeps up. Of course, Margaret turned from the window, suddenly reluctant to break this moment of connection. Thank you again for everything, the rescue, the dinner, the kindness. I don't know how to repay you. No need to repay anything. It's what neighbors do. Neighbors. Margaret couldn't remember the last time someone had called her a neighbor or when she'd felt like one. In her high-rise condo in Boston, she barely knew the people on her own floor. Good night, Thomas. Good night, Margaret. The spare room was indeed basic, a single bed with a simple quilt, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward the mainland. And Margaret could see lights in the distance, the world she'd left behind when the tide rose and swallowed her car. She lay in the narrow bed listening to the storm and the rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam outside her window. Tomorrow the water would recede and she'd find a way back to her scheduled life. The house sale could be rescheduled, her assistant would handle the disruption, and everything would return to normal. But as sleep finally took her, Margaret found herself thinking not about tomorrow's logistics, but about the warmth of this simple house, the kindness of strangers who'd become temporary neighbors, and the unfamiliar feeling of being somewhere that felt like home. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep, keeping watch over the dark water, guiding lost souls through the storm towards safety. Margaret woke to silence. The storm had blown itself out during the night, leaving behind the kind of crystalline morning that made the previous evening's chaos seem like a dream. Sunlight streamed through the spare room's window, revealing a world transformed. What had been gray and threatening was now blue and peaceful, as if the sea had decided to apologize for its previous tantrum. She checked her phone, still no signal. then dressed in Emma's borrowed clothes and made her way downstairs. The lighthouse house felt different in daylight, more spacious somehow, with morning sun revealing details that had been hidden in the evening's shadows. Thomas was in the kitchen, standing at the stove with a cup of coffee in one hand and a spatula in the other. He'd changed into work clothes, faded jeans, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days, but still looked sturdy and comfortable. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's in the pot, and hope you like it strong." Margaret poured herself a cup, grateful for the familiar ritual. The coffee was indeed strong, dark and rich, with the kind of substance that spoke of long winters and early mornings. "How's the water level?" "Dropping. Should be passable by this afternoon, completely clear by tonight." Thomas flipped what looked like pancakes on the griddle. "Emma's already gone, catches the early boat to school on Tuesdays and Thursdays." "Boat. Water taxi, only way to get to the mainland during school months. She stays overnight with a friend's family on school days, comes home Wednesday evenings and weekends." Margaret tried to imagine that kind of commute as a teenager. The dedication it required not just from Emma, but from Thomas, who had to coordinate this complex schedule week after week. That must be exhausting for her. She's used to it, been doing it since she started high school. Thomas slid 3 pancakes onto a plate and handed it to Margaret. Syrup's on the table, butter's in the dish. The pancakes were perfect, light and fluffy with a hint of vanilla. Margaret realized she was hungrier than she'd been in months. "These are delicious, thank you." "My grandmother's recipe. She taught me to cook when I was about Emma's age." Thomas poured batter for another pancake. "Said a man who couldn't feed himself was only half a person." Smart woman. Margaret took another bite, savoring not just the food, but the peaceful morning, the easy conversation. What was she like? "Tough as old leather and twice as durable. Lived in this house for 60 years, raised 4 kids, mostly on her own, while my grandfather was at sea." Thomas's voice carried the warmth of good memories. "She used to say the lighthouse wasn't just about guiding ships, it was about providing a fixed point when everything else was shifting." "Is that why you stayed, to be that fixed point?" Thomas considered the question as he flipped his pancake. "Partly, but also because this is where I learned what home meant. After my wife died, Emma and we needed somewhere stable, somewhere that wouldn't change just because our world had fallen apart." Margaret understood that impulse. After Richard's death, she'd thrown herself into maintaining their lifestyle exactly as it had been. Same restaurants, same social circle, same routines. The difference was that Thomas had chosen genuine stability while she'd chosen the illusion of it. "Can I ask what happened to your wife?" "Complications during childbirth. Everything seemed fine, and then—" Thomas shrugged with the helplessness of someone who'd long ago accepted that some questions had no answers. "The doctors said it was just one of those things. Random. Couldn't have been predicted or prevented." "I'm sorry." "Long time ago now." Thomas joined her at the table with his own plate. "What about your husband?" "You said mountain climbing." "Avalanche in Colorado. He was with a group, experienced guides, all the right equipment." Margaret stirred her coffee, watching the cream swirl through the dark liquid. "Also random, also unpredictable." They ate in companionable silence for a while, 2 people who understood that some losses were too big for words, too arbitrary for comfort. Outside the window, Margaret could see the water continuing to recede, exposing the causeway inch by inch. "What will you do when I'm gone?" The question surprised Margaret even as she asked it. She hadn't meant to be so direct, so personal. "Same thing I do every day. Maintain the equipment, monitor the radio, keep an eye on the water." Thomas's answer was the same as yesterday, but there was something underneath it now, a weariness he hadn't let show before. "That's not what I meant." Thomas looked at her across the table, and Margaret saw something shift in his expression. A door opening, just a crack. "I don't know," he admitted. "For 16 years, everything I've done has been about taking care of Emma, making sure she had what she needed. When she leaves—" He trailed off, then started again. "I've gotten good at being needed. Not sure I remember how to just be very—" Margaret felt something twist in her chest, recognition perhaps, or sympathy. "I sold my business because I couldn't remember how to want things for myself instead of for us. Richard and we built everything together. When he was gone, I kept running the galleries because that's what we would have done, but I didn't know what I wanted to do." "Do you know now?" It was Margaret's turn to consider. "I thought I did. I thought I wanted simplicity, freedom, fewer responsibilities. That's why I'm selling the house, cutting ties, minimizing complications. She looked around the kitchen, taking in its worn comfort, its sense of being lived in rather than displayed. But sitting here watching you and Emma together, I'm not sure anymore. What do you mean? You have something I lost when Richard died. Purpose that's bigger than just getting through the day. Connection that matters. Margaret finished her coffee, setting the cup down carefully. I've been so focused on reducing my life to manageable pieces that I forgot about building it into something meaningful. Thomas studied her with those steady gray eyes. What would meaningful look like for you? I don't know. The admission felt both frightening and liberating. I used to know exactly what I wanted: the next acquisition for the gallery, the next client to cultivate, the next goal to achieve. Now I feel like I'm floating, waiting for the tide to carry me somewhere. Sometimes that's not such a bad thing, Thomas said quietly. Sometimes you have to let go before you can figure out where you're supposed to land. Margaret looked out the window again. The causeway was almost completely visible now, a dark line across the water that would soon reconnect her to her mainland life. In a few hours, she'd be back in her car, a rental probably, driving back to Boston, back to her empty condo and her carefully organized existence. The thought filled her with an unexpected sense of loss. Would you like to see the lighthouse? Thomas asked suddenly. The tower, I mean. Most people who visit here never get the chance to go up. Margaret felt a flicker of something that might have been excitement. I'd love to. They finished breakfast and headed outside into the crisp morning air. Up close, the lighthouse was even more impressive than it had appeared from the water. A white tower rising 60 feet into the blue sky, its red roof bright as a cardinal's wing against the pale stone. Built in 1847, Thomas said as he unlocked a heavy wooden door at the tower's base. Original Fresnel lens is still operational, though the light's been automated since 1907. The interior was a spiral staircase winding around the curved walls, each step worn smooth by generations of lighthouse keepers. Margaret followed Thomas up, her breath coming shorter as they climbed her legs, reminding her that gallery openings and board meetings weren't exactly athletic training. How many steps? She asked, pausing at a small landing. 97, Thomas said without stopping. Emma used to count them when she was little, made a game of racing me to the top. They climbed in silence after that, Margaret focusing on putting one foot in front of the other while Thomas moved with the easy rhythm of someone who'd made this climb thousands of times. Finally, they emerged into the lamp room at the top, and Margaret's breath caught not from the climb this time, but from the view. From 60 feet up, she could see everything: the mainland coast stretching north and south, the pattern of islands scattered across the blue water, the causeway now clearly visible as a dark ribbon connecting their small island to the larger world. The storm that had seemed so overwhelming the night before was revealed as just one small drama in a vast, beautiful landscape. It's incredible, she breathed, turning slowly to take in the full panorama. Emma says it's the closest thing to flying without leaving the ground, Thomas said, checking some kind of gauge near the massive lens. I never get tired of it. Margaret could understand why. From up here, problems looked manageable. Perspectives shifted, priorities rearranged themselves. The urgent seemed less urgent, the overwhelming seemed conquerable. How do you choose when to turn the light on? She asked. It's automatic now, comes on at sunset, goes off at sunrise. But back in the day, keepers had to judge conditions. Watch the weather, decide when ships might need guidance. Thomas ran his hand along the brass housing of the lens. My grandmother used to say it wasn't just about the dark, it was about knowing when people were likely to be lost. Margaret thought about that as she watched a small fishing boat make its way across the distant water, a white wake spreading behind it like a smile. Were there many shipwrecks here? Dozens over the years. The coastline's tricky, lots of hidden rocks, sudden shallow currents that change with the tide. Before the lighthouse was built, ships went down here regularly. Thomas pointed toward a section of water that looked no different from any other to Margaret's eyes. There's a merchant vessel from 1845 sitting in 30 feet of water, right about there. During storms, you can still see pieces of the mast. Did anyone survive? 3 out of 27. They made it to shore half frozen and barely alive. The lighthouse keeper at the time, my great-great-grandfather, took them in, nursed them back to health. One of them ended up staying, marrying a local girl, starting a family. He was saved by a lighthouse keeper, and then he just stayed. Sometimes being rescued changes your whole sense of where you belong, Thomas said simply. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. A recognition, perhaps, or a resonance. She turned from the window to study Thomas's profile as he worked on some piece of equipment, his movements sure and practiced. Being rescued changes your whole sense of where you belong. Thomas, she began, then stopped, not sure how to finish the thought. He looked up from his work. What is it? Nothing, thank you for bringing me up here, for sharing this. Something passed between them in that moment, not words but understanding. They were both people who'd learned to be careful with their hearts, careful with connections that might shift the ground beneath their feet. But something was shifting anyway, had been shifting since the moment Thomas had pulled her from the rising water. They climbed back down in comfortable silence, emerging into the bright morning to find a small motorboat approaching the dock. Thomas shaded his eyes against the sun, then waved. Coast Guard, he explained. They always check on us after big storms. The boat pulled up to the dock, and a young man in uniform climbed out friendly-faced, probably not much older than Emma. Morning, Thomas. Everything okay out here? We had reports of someone getting caught by the tide surge yesterday. Everyone's fine, Danny, Thomas replied. Had a visitor get stranded, but she's safe and sound. Danny's gaze shifted to Margaret, taking in her borrowed clothes and obvious city origins with the kind of polite curiosity small communities specialized in. You're the one whose car went under. We found it this morning about half a mile south of where the causeway starts, completely submerged. Margaret felt her heart sink. Is it salvageable? Afraid not, ma'am. Salt water got into everything. You'll want to call your insurance company, file a total loss claim. Danny's voice was sympathetic. Sorry, I know that's not what you wanted to hear. Margaret nodded, trying to process this development. Her car with her purse, her phone, her carefully organized life was gone. Completely, irretrievably gone. We can give you a ride back to the mainland when you're ready, Danny continued. Coast Guard's happy to help with transportation after situations like this. That's very kind of you, Margaret said automatically, though part of her wanted to refuse to find some reason to stay a little longer. No hurry, Thomas added. The causeway will be clear in a few hours if you'd rather wait. Margaret looked between the two men, aware that a decision was being asked of her. She could leave now, with the Coast Guard begin the process of dealing with the insurance claims and car rentals and returning to her normal life. Or she could stay a little longer, extend this unexpected pause in her carefully scheduled existence. I think I'll wait, she heard herself say. If that's all right with you, Thomas, I'd like to see the house I was supposed to visit yesterday. Of course, Thomas said, and Margaret thought she detected something like relief in his voice. Danny nodded and prepared to cast off. Well, if you need anything, just radio the station. We monitor channel 16. After the Coast Guard boat disappeared around the point, Thomas and Margaret walked back toward the house. The sun was getting warmer, burning off the last of the morning mist and revealing the island in full detail. Margaret could see a small garden behind the house, raised beds with the season's last tomatoes and what looked like winter squash. You grow your own food. Some of it. Emma likes gardening, and it makes sense to be as self-sufficient as possible out here. Thomas gestured toward the beds. We've got solar panels for electricity, a well for water, generators for backup power. When the weather's bad, sometimes we're cut off for days at a time. Margaret tried to imagine that kind of self-reliance. Her idea of being prepared was making sure her assistant kept her calendar updated and her cleaning service had a key to her condo. Doesn't it get lonely? All that isolation? Lonely and alone aren't the same thing, Thomas said thoughtfully. I'm alone a lot, but I'm not often lonely. There's something about this place, the rhythm of the tides, the constancy of the light, the sense of purpose that fills up the spaces where loneliness might creep in. They reached the house and Thomas paused on the front steps. What about you? In the city surrounded by people, are you lonely? The question hit closer to home than Margaret had expected. In Boston, she was surrounded by acquaintance, business contacts, service providers, a whole network of people who knew her name and her preferences. But how many of them actually knew her? How many would she call if she needed help, comfort, genuine connection? Yes, she admitted quietly. I think I am. Thomas nodded as if this didn't surprise him. Grief can do that, make you feel surrounded by people, but still fundamentally alone, like you're speaking a language no one else understands. How did you avoid that? After your wife died with a new baby, all that responsibility. I had Emma. She gave me a reason to keep going, to build something meaningful even when everything felt broken. Thomas sat down on the steps looking out toward the water. But also I had this place. The lighthouse doesn't care about your personal problems. Ships need guidance whether you're having a good day or a terrible one. There's something healing about being part of something larger than your own pain. Margaret sat beside him, surprising herself. When was the last time she'd sat on steps in the middle of the morning having a conversation that wasn't about business or schedules? I think that's what I lost when Richard died. The sense of being part of something larger. What was it like, your life together? Margaret found herself smiling at the memory. Busy, wonderful but busy. We were both ambitious. I was building the galleries, he was developing real estate. We traveled constantly, went to openings and premieres, threw dinner parties, collected art and experiences and stories. Everything was always in motion. Sounds exciting. It was, but it was also, Margaret searched for the right word, exhausting, I think. We were so focused on building our life together that we sometimes forgot to actually live it. We kept saying we'd slow down next year, take that long vacation, spend more quiet time together. But there was always another opportunity, another project, another goal. And then he was gone. And then he was gone, and I was left with this elaborate life that only made sense as part of a pair. The gallery openings, the social events, the dinner parties, they all felt hollow without him there to share them with. Margaret picked at a loose thread on Emma's borrowed jeans. I kept going through the motions for a while, thinking that maintaining the routine would help me heal. But it just made the loneliness worse. Is that why you sold the business? Partly, but also because I realized I'd been so busy building a life that looked successful from the outside that I'd never stopped to ask what would make me happy from the inside. Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching a seagull circle overhead. And what would make you happy? It was the same question he'd asked earlier, but this time Margaret felt closer to an answer. I think I want to be useful again. Not just successful, but genuinely helpful to something or someone that matters. I want to wake up with a sense of purpose instead of just a list of tasks. That's what Emma's trying to figure out too, Thomas said softly. How to build a life that means something, not just one that pays the bills. She's lucky to have you as an example. You've built exactly that kind of life. Have I? Thomas sounded genuinely uncertain. Some days I wonder if I've just been hiding, using Emma's needs and the lighthouse's demands as an excuse not to take risks, not to put myself out there. Margaret studied his profile, seeing the doubt that lived beneath his steady exterior. What kind of risks? Personal ones, emotional ones. Thomas glanced at her, then away. I haven't even been on a date since Emma's mother died. Told myself it was because Emma needed stability, because the lighthouse required my full attention. But maybe I was just scared. Of what? Of caring about someone again and losing them. Of disrupting the careful balance Emma and I had found. Of discovering that I'm not actually brave, just stubborn. Margaret felt a flutter of something dangerous in her chest. And now, with Emma about to leave for college, now I'm realizing that being safe isn't the same as being alive. They sat in silence after that, both lost in their own thoughts. The sun was climbing higher, and Margaret could see that the causeway was almost completely clear. In another hour or two, she'd be able to drive across it if she could find a car to rent away to replace everything she'd lost in the flood. But for now, she was content to sit on these steps with this man who understood something about loss and healing and the courage required to start over. For now, she was exactly where she needed to be. The afternoon passed quietly. Thomas had work to do, routine maintenance on the lighthouse equipment, radio checks with the Coast Guard station, repairs to some storm damage around the property. Margaret found herself helping without being asked, holding tools while he fixed a loose shutter, helping him clear debris from the dock. It felt good to be useful, to work with her hands, to contribute to something concrete and immediate. When was the last time she'd done physical work? When was the last time she'd felt the satisfaction of fixing something that was broken? You're pretty handy for a gallery owner, Thomas observed as Margaret successfully rewired a dock light that had been damaged in the storm. Richard taught me some basic electrical work. He said it was important to understand how things actually work, not just how they looked. Margaret tested the light, smiling. when it flickered on. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed it. What else did you forget? Margaret considered the question as she coiled the extra wire. Cooking. I used to love to cook, but after Richard died, I mostly ate out or ordered in. It seemed pointless to make meals for one person. Emma could teach you to make bread, Thomas offered. She's gotten really good at it during the pandemic. Said it helped with stress. The offer was casual, but it carried implications that made Margaret's pulse quicken. Teaching someone to make bread wasn't a one-afternoon activity. It suggested future conversations, ongoing connection, a reason to return. I'd like that, Margaret said carefully. Thomas nodded, but she caught something in his expression, the same careful hope she was feeling, the same awareness that they were talking about more than bread recipes. The sun was beginning to set when Emma's water taxi appeared on the horizon. Margaret watched the small boat approach, feeling a mix of anticipation and something like anxiety. How would the teenager react to finding Margaret still here? Would she see it as an intrusion, a complication in her carefully balanced life with her father? Emma climbed onto the dock with the easy confidence of someone who'd been making this journey for years, her school bag slung over one shoulder and a grocery bag in her other hand. "You're still here," she said to Margaret, and it wasn't quite a question. "My car was completely flooded. The Coast Guard found it this morning." Margaret felt the need to justify her continued presence. "I was waiting for the causeway to clear." Emma nodded, accepting this explanation, but Margaret caught her glancing between her father and their unexpected guest with the sharp observation skills of a teenager who'd learned to read adult undercurrents. "How was school?" Thomas asked, taking the grocery bag from his daughter. "Fine. Mrs. Peterson says the college application essays are due next month." Emma's gaze drifted to Margaret again. "She also said there's a guest speaker coming next week, someone from Maine Maritime, who'll talk about their programs." "That's good. You should definitely attend." They walked back to the house together, Emma chattering about her classes while Margaret listened, struck by the easy affection between father and daughter. There was genuine respect here. She realized Emma treated Thomas as an equal, someone whose opinions mattered, while Thomas clearly trusted his daughter's judgment and independence. It made Margaret think of her own relationship with her parents, formal and careful, even now built on performance and achievement rather than genuine intimacy. When was the last time she'd had a conversation with them about something that really mattered to her? "Margaret helped me fix the dock light today," Thomas mentioned as they reached the house. "Really?" Emma looked surprised. "You know how to do electrical work?" "Basic stuff. My husband taught me." Margaret found that talking about Richard was getting easier, less sharp around the edges. He believed in learning how things worked. "That's cool. Most of Dad's friends from town won't even hold a flashlight for him." Emma dropped her backpack by the door. "Are you staying for dinner?" The question was direct in the way only teenagers could manage without social cushioning, but also without malice. Margaret looked at Thomas, uncertain about the protocol for extending her own invitation. "The causeway's clear," Thomas said, "but you're welcome to stay as long as you'd like." The choice was hers, and Margaret realized that for the first time in years, she genuinely didn't know what she wanted to do. Her logical mind said she should leave, call for a taxi, arrange a rental car, begin the process of returning to normal life. But another part of her, a part that had been quiet for too long, wanted to stay for dinner to extend this unexpected pause a little longer. "I'd like to stay," she said, "if you're sure it's not an imposition." "It's not," Emma said firmly. "And besides, I want to hear more about the art gallery business. I might want to minor in art history." Margaret felt a spark of the old enthusiasm, the joy she'd found in sharing knowledge about art and artists. "I'd love to tell you about it. I'd then." Dinner was another revelation, not just the food, which was simple but excellent, but the conversation. Emma asked thoughtful questions about the art world, about building a business, about navigating career choices. Thomas listened with the kind of focused attention Margaret rarely encountered in her usual social circles, where everyone seemed more interested in waiting for their turn to talk than actually hearing what others said. "What made you choose contemporary art over classical?" Emma asked as she helped clear the table. "Contemporary art tells the story of our time," Margaret explained. "Classical art is beautiful, but contemporary art is alive. It's responding to current events, exploring modern anxieties, pushing boundaries. When I could help a client understand a piece that initially challenged or confused them, when I could help them see what the artist was trying to say about our world, That's when I felt most useful. Do you miss it? Thomas asked. Margaret considered the question honestly. I miss the good parts, the discovery, the education, the moments when art genuinely moves someone. I don't miss the competition, the social politics, the constant pressure to stay relevant. What if you could have the good parts without the rest? Emma asked. Like, what if you taught art history or curated for a smaller museum? The suggestion hit Margaret like a small shock of recognition. I, I never thought about that. I've been so focused on either running my own business or getting out of the art world entirely. But there might be middle ground. There's always middle ground, Thomas said quietly. Sometimes we just can't see it when we're standing too close to the problem. After dinner, they moved to the living room where Emma worked on homework, while Thomas tended the fire and Margaret found herself browsing his extensive collection of maritime books. The evening settled around them with comfortable domesticity, and Margaret realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd spent an evening without television, without constant phone notifications, without the hum of city noise. The silence here wasn't empty, it was full of the sound of pages turning, pencils scratching on paper logs, settling in the fireplace, waves against the rocks outside. I should head to bed soon, Emma announced around 9 o'clock. Early boat tomorrow. Of course. Margaret looked up from the book she'd been reading, A History of New England Lighthouses. Thank you for dinner for the conversation. You ask excellent questions. Emma smiled, and for the first time since Margaret's arrival, it was completely unguarded. Thanks for answering them. Most adults either talk down to me or act like I'm too young to understand anything important. You're clearly capable of understanding quite a lot. After Emma went upstairs, Thomas and Margaret found themselves alone again, the fire crackling between them and the lighthouse beam sweeping regularly past the windows. She's remarkable, Margaret said. You should be proud. I am, but I'm also terrified about letting her go. Because you'll miss her, or because you're not sure who you are without her? Thomas looked at her with something like surprise. Both, I think. Being Emma's father has been my primary identity for 16 years. Without that, you'll still be a lighthouse keeper. Still be the person who rescues people from storms. Will I? The Coast Guard's been talking about full automation of the remaining manned stations. GPS and modern navigation have made lighthouses less critical than they used to be. Thomas prodded the fire with unnecessary focus. They might not need a keeper at all much longer. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. What would you do then? I don't know. I've been avoiding thinking about it, telling myself it won't happen anytime soon. But with Emma leaving, Thomas shrugged with forced casualness, as in, maybe it's time to face the fact that this life I've built is ending whether I want it to or not. Or maybe it's time to figure out what the next version looks like. Thomas looked at her firelight playing across his weathered features. What about you? What does the next version of Margaret Hale look like? It was the question she'd been avoiding for months, maybe years. But sitting here in this peaceful room with this man who understood something about transition and loss and the courage required to start over, she found herself actually considering it seriously. I think, she said slowly, it looks like someone who's learned the difference between being successful and being fulfilled. Someone who's found a way to be useful without being overwhelmed. Someone who's willing to take emotional risks again. That sounds like a good version. What about you? What would the next version of Thomas Reed look like? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. Someone who's learned that taking care of people doesn't have to mean sacrificing yourself completely. Someone who's found a way to be needed without being trapped by that need. Someone who's willing to build something new instead of just maintaining what already exists. They sat in comfortable silence after that, both lost in thoughts of futures that suddenly seemed possible rather than terrifying. Outside, the lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep, keeping watch over the dark water, guiding lost souls through the night toward safety. Margaret realized that she was no longer thinking about leaving in the morning. She was thinking about reasons to stay. Margaret woke before dawn, pulled from sleep by the rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam across her window. For a moment, she lay in the narrow bed, listening to the house settle around her, trying to remember where she was. Then it came back, the storm, the rescue, this unexpected pause in her carefully controlled life. She dressed quietly in Emma's borrowed clothes and made her way downstairs, following the smell of coffee to the kitchen. Thomas was already there, standing at the window with a steaming mug in his hands, watching the sun paint the horizon pink and gold. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked without turning around. "I'm usually up early. Old habit from the gallery days, there was always something that needed attention before the day officially started." Margaret poured herself coffee, grateful for the warmth and the familiar ritual. "What about you?" "I like the mornings out here. It's when you can really see what the night brought in." Thomas gestured toward the window. "Storms always rearrange things, driftwood, seaweed, sometimes things that have been lost for years washing up on shore." Margaret joined him at the window, looking out over the calm water that showed no trace of the previous night's violence. "Do you ever find anything interesting? Last month, a message in a bottle from some kids in Nova Scotia. Year before that, part of a ship's wheel from a wreck that went down in 1923. Thomas smiled at the memory. Emma likes to think the sea gives up its secrets when it's ready. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the world wake up. Margaret found herself studying Thomas's profile again, struck by how peaceful he seemed in his own skin. When was the last time she'd felt that kind of centeredness? "Thomas," she began, then stopped, not sure how to voice what she was thinking. "What is it?" "I should probably head back today. Get a rental car deal with the insurance company, return to normal life." The words felt heavy in her mouth. "But I don't want to." Thomas turned from the window to look at her directly. "Why not?" "Because I can't remember the last time I felt this settled, this present, like I wasn't rushing toward the next appointment or obligation." Margaret set down her coffee cup, needing something to do with errands. "I know that sounds silly, considering I've only been here 2 days." "It doesn't sound silly." "It doesn't. Margaret, you were rescued from a life-threatening situation and then stranded in unfamiliar circumstances. It would be strange if that didn't shift your perspective on some things." Thomas's voice was gentle but honest. "The question is what you want to do with that shift." Before Margaret could answer, footsteps on the stairs announced Emma's arrival. The teenager appeared in the kitchen, already dressed for school, her hair pulled back and her book bag slung over her shoulder. "Morning, Dad." "Morning, Margaret." Emma grabbed a piece of toast from the counter and began spreading peanut butter on it with quick, efficient movements. "The water taxi's early today. Captain wants to beat some weather coming in this afternoon." Margaret felt a pang of disappointment. She'd been looking forward to another conversation with Emma, to learning more about the girl's college plans and her thoughts on art history. "Will I see you again before I leave?" Margaret asked. Emma paused in her toast preparation, glancing between Margaret and her father with that sharp teenage awareness of adult undercurrents. "Are you leaving today?" I, I'm not sure." "Well, if you're still here, tomorrow night I could show you how to make bread. Dad mentioned you might be interested." Emma's offer was casual, but Margaret caught the slight smile that accompanied it. "I'd love that." Emma finished her breakfast, standing up, kissed her father's cheek, and headed for the door. "See you tonight, Dad." "Bye, Margaret. Hope you stick around." After Emma left, the kitchen felt quieter, more intimate. Margaret and Thomas finished their coffee in comfortable silence, both of them processing what had just happened. Emma's casual acceptance of Margaret's potential extended stay felt like a kind of permission, or perhaps a gentle push. "She likes you," Thomas observed. "She's easy to like. You've raised an exceptional person." "She's raised herself mostly. I just tried not to mess her up too badly." Thomas rinsed his coffee mug in the sink. "What do you want to do today, besides figure out whether you're leaving or staying?" Margaret considered the question. What did she want to do with a day that had no scheduled appointments, no pressing deadlines, no obligations beyond her own choices? "Could you show me more of the island? I realized yesterday that I've never really explored it, just drove straight to the house whenever Richard and I visited." "I'd like that." They spent the morning walking the island's perimeter, following paths that Thomas knew by heart, but which were completely new to Margaret. He showed her tide pools filled with sea anemones and hermit crabs, a small cove where seals sometimes hauled out to rest, a section of shoreline where you could find sea glass if you knew where to look. Margaret found herself genuinely fascinated by this world she'd never taken time to notice. The way Thomas talked about the island's ecosystem, its seasonal changes, its hidden beauties, reminded her of how she used to talk about art with passion and deep knowledge, and the desire to share something wonderful with someone who might learn to love it too. How long did it take you to learn all this? She asked, as Thomas pointed out the difference between periwinkles and moon snails. I'm still learning. That's part of what I love about this place. There's always something new to discover, some pattern you hadn't noticed before. Thomas straightened up from the tide pool they'd been examining. Emma's the real naturalist in the family. She's been keeping detailed records of wildlife populations since she was 12. Is that what sparked her interest in marine biology? Partly, but I think it's also about wanting to protect something she loves. She's watched climate change affect these waters. Species appearing that don't belong here. Others disappearing, water temperatures shifting. She wants to be part of the solution. Margaret admired that sense of purpose, the clarity of wanting to protect something precious. What about you? If the lighthouse automation goes through, would you stay on the island? Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching waves break against the rocks below them. I've thought about that a lot lately. This place has been my whole world for so long. I'm not sure I know how to exist anywhere else. But staying here without purpose, he shrugged, that might be lonelier than leaving. What if you could find new purpose here, something that used your knowledge of the island, your skills, your love for this place? Like what? Margaret found herself thinking, like the businesswoman she'd been identifying. Resources, seeing opportunities, imagining solutions. Environmental education, maybe. Ecotourism. This island is incredibly beautiful. But more than that, it's a perfect example of coastal ecosystems that most people never get to see up close. Thomas looked at her with interest. You mean like guided tours or workshops, educational programs for schools, researchers, conservation groups? Margaret's excitement was building as the idea took shape. You have the knowledge, the perfect location, the infrastructure. And with Emma studying marine biology, you'd have access to current research, new methodologies. That's, that's actually not a bad idea, Thomas said slowly. There are plenty of people doing whale watches and scenic boat tours, but not many offering real education about coastal ecosystems. You could start small, test the concept with a few groups, see what works, build from there. Margaret realized she was using the same tone she'd used when helping clients envision how a particular piece of art would transform their space. The lighthouse could be part of it, the history, the technology, the role lighthouses played in maritime commerce. Thomas was quiet, but Margaret could see him thinking, turning the idea over in his mind. It would take time to develop, money to get started. I'd need permits, insurance, marketing. All solvable problems. Margaret said automatically, then caught herself. Sorry, old habits. I tend to jump straight into implementation mode when I get excited about an idea. Don't apologize. It's helpful to talk to someone who understands how to build things from scratch. Thomas looked out over the water, then back at Margaret. What about you? Would you ever consider being part of something like that? The question caught Margaret off guard. What do you mean? You have experience with marketing, client relations, business development. You understand education, know how to help people see value in things they might not initially appreciate. And Thomas's voice was careful, as if he was testing an idea. A partnership, maybe, if you were interested. Margaret felt her heart speed up. You are talking about a business partnership. I'm talking about possibility, a way for both of us to use what we know to build something meaningful. Together. The word hung in the air between them, together. Not just business partners, but something more complex, more personal. Margaret realized they'd moved from discussing practical possibilities to discussing the shape their lives might take if they were brave enough to choose each other. Thomas, She stopped suddenly, aware that they were standing at a crossroads that went far beyond career decisions. I know it's complicated, Thomas said quietly. I know we barely know each other, and I know I'm probably getting ahead of myself. But Margaret, something's happening here. Something I wasn't expecting and don't completely understand, but something real. Margaret's chest felt tight with a mixture of hope and terror. I feel it too. So what do we do about it? Before Margaret could answer, her phone buzzed in her pocket. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. The outside world felt very far away just then. But habit was strong, and she glanced at the screen. 17 missed calls, dozens of text messages, all from her assistant. I should check this, Margaret said apologetically, scrolling through the messages. What she read made her stomach drop. What is it? Thomas asked, seeing her expression change. My assistant's been trying to reach me. The buyers for the vacation house, they're threatening to pull out of the deal if I don't close by Friday. They've found another property and they're saying I've breached the agreement by not showing up for Tuesday's appointment. Margaret felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her chest. The same feeling she'd lived with for months. The sense of constantly fighting to keep her carefully organized life from falling apart. Can you extend the deadline? Explain what happened. Maybe, but I'd need to get back, meet with lawyers, possibly renegotiate the entire contract. Margaret looked at her phone again, seeing more messages appearing in real time. And there's something else. My assistant says there's interest from a museum in Hartford. They want to discuss bringing me on as a consulting curator for a contemporary art initiative. Thomas nodded slowly. That sounds like an opportunity. It could be. It's exactly the kind of middle ground Emma suggested, using my expertise without the business ownership stress. Margaret stared at the screen, feeling the pull of her old life reasserting itself. They want to meet this week. They walked back toward the lighthouse in relative silence, both of them processing this intrusion of practical reality into what had felt like a separate world. Margaret's phone continued to buzz with messages, each one pulling her further back toward the life she'd temporarily left behind. At the house, Margaret sat at the kitchen table and began making calls. Insurance company first to report the car and start the claim process. Then her assistant to get details about the house sale and the museum opportunity. Then a rental car company to arrange transportation back to Boston. With each call, she felt herself slipping back into her old patterns, efficient, decisive, and control. But she was also aware of Thomas moving around the kitchen behind her and of how each conversation took her further away from the possibility they'd been discussing on the shore. The rental car company can have someone here by this afternoon, she told Thomas after finishing the last call. And I've got a meeting with the museum people tomorrow morning. That's good. Those both sound like positive developments. But Thomas's voice was carefully neutral, and Margaret realized he was already beginning to pull back to protect himself from the disappointment of a connection that might not survive the return of real-world obligations. Thomas, about what we were discussing earlier. It's okay, he said, not meeting her eyes. I understand. You have a life to get back to, responsibilities to handle. What we were talking about was just wishful thinking. That's not true, isn't it? Thomas turned to face her, and Margaret saw something that looked like resignation in his expression. Margaret, you're a successful businesswoman with opportunities in major cities. I'm a lighthouse keeper on a remote island with a teenage daughter and an uncertain future. What we have here, it's been wonderful, but it's not realistic long term. Margaret wanted to argue with him, but part of her understood his logic. The life she was returning to was real, concrete, full of opportunities she'd worked years to create. What she had here was, a few days of peace conversations with a man who made her feel understood, the fantasy of a simpler life. Maybe you're right, she heard herself say, though the words felt like giving up something precious. They spent the rest of the morning in a kind of careful politeness, both of them stepping back from the emotional ground they'd been exploring. Thomas returned to his lighthouse maintenance while Margaret organized her affairs and prepared for departure. Emma returned from school earlier than usual, arriving just as the rental car pulled up to the lighthouse dock on a water taxi. You're really leaving, Emma said, watching Margaret transfer her few belongings to the rental car, a basic sedan that felt alien after days of walking and taking boats. I have some business things I need to handle, Margaret explained, and there might be a job opportunity I should explore. Emma nodded with the resigned understanding of someone who'd watched other adults leave her island refuge for the complications of mainland life. Will we see you again? Margaret glanced at Thomas, who was helping the rental car driver understand the causeway conditions. I don't know, sweetheart. I hope so. Dad really likes you, Emma said suddenly. I can tell. He's different when you're around, more like himself instead of just my father, if that makes sense. Margaret felt her throat tighten. I like him too. And you? Very much. Then why are you leaving? It was a perfectly reasonable question from a 16-year-old, and Margaret realized she didn't have a good answer. Because she was scared, because it was easier to return to known complications than risk unknown possibilities. Because she'd spent so long being careful that she'd forgotten how to be brave. Sometimes adults make things more complicated than they need to be, Margaret said finally. Emma smiled with the wisdom of someone who'd been watching adults do exactly that for years. Yeah, I've noticed. Margaret hugged Emma goodbye, surprised by how much she'd grown to care about this thoughtful, direct teenager. Then she approached Thomas, who was checking the rental car's tire pressure with the thoroughness he brought to everything. Thank you, she said, for rescuing me, for taking me in, for sharing your home and your life. These have been the best few days I've had in longer than I can remember. Thomas straightened up, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Take care of yourself, Margaret. I hope the museum opportunity works out. What about the educational tourism idea? Will you think about pursuing that? Maybe, probably, it's a good idea regardless of everything else. Margaret wanted to say more, wanted to find words that would bridge the careful distance they'd created between themselves. But the rental car driver was waiting, and her phone was already buzzing with new messages, and the momentum of departure had taken over. She drove away from the lighthouse without looking back, but she could see Thomas and Emma in her rearview mirror, standing on the dock until she disappeared around the curve toward the mainland. The drive back to Boston felt surreal, returning to highways and traffic and the constant hum of activity after days of silence and simplicity. Margaret's condo, when she finally reached it, seemed too large and too quiet, decorated in shades of beige and cream that suddenly struck her as sterile. She stood in her living room looking at art she'd collected with Richard years ago and felt like she was visiting a museum of her former life. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, but she was different. The woman who lived in this space seemed like a stranger. Her assistant had left a stack of mail and messages on the kitchen counter, along with a detailed briefing about the museum opportunity. The Hartford Museum of Contemporary Art was launching an initiative to make their collection more accessible to diverse audiences, and they wanted someone with Margaret's background to develop educational programs and community outreach. It was perfect, exactly the kind of meaningful work she'd been craving, using her skills for something larger than profit margins. She should have been excited. Instead, she found herself thinking about Thomas's idea for educational programs on the island, about the possibility of teaching people to see and appreciate a different kind of art, the art of natural systems, coastal ecosystems, the interplay between human history and environmental forces. That night, Margaret lay in her king-size bed listening to the sounds of the city traffic sirens, the hum of air conditioning systems, and thought about falling asleep to the rhythm of waves and the sweep of the lighthouse beam. She'd been gone less than 12 hours, but she felt homesick for a place that wasn't her home. The meeting with the Hartford Museum went well. The director was enthusiastic about Margaret's background, and the scope of the position was everything she'd hoped for: creative freedom, educational focus, the chance to build something meaningful from the ground up. When could you start? The director asked as they concluded their second meeting. I'd need to finalize some personal business first, Margaret heard herself say. Give me a week to confirm. Of course. But Margaret, I hope you're seriously considering this. You'd be perfect for what we're trying to accomplish here. Driving back to Boston, Margaret tried to understand her reluctance to immediately accept what was clearly a dream job. The position offered everything she thought she wanted: purposeful work, creative challenge, the chance to educate and inspire others. So why did accepting it feel like settling? Her phone rang as she pulled into her building's parking garage. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a Maine area code. Hello, Margaret, it's Emma. I'm calling from school. Margaret felt her heart skip. Emma, is everything okay? Is your father all right? He's fine. Well, physically. But Margaret, he's been really weird since you left. Like more quiet than usual, and he keeps starting projects and then abandoning them halfway through. Margaret pulled into her parking space but didn't turn off the car. What kind of projects? That's the thing he's been researching, that educational tourism idea you guys talked about. He's got books about small business development spread all over the kitchen table, and he's been making lists of what it would take to get permits and licenses and stuff. Margaret felt something flutter in her chest. That's good, isn't it? That he's exploring the idea. It would be if he seemed excited about it, but he's approaching it like it's homework, not like it's something he actually wants to do. Emma's voice carried the frustration of someone wise enough to see a problem but too young to fix it. Margaret, I think he's trying to talk himself out of it. Why would he do that? Because he's scared. And because he thinks you're not coming back. So what's the point of building something that was supposed to be for both of you? Margaret closed her eyes, leaning back against the car seat. Emma, I don't know if I'm coming back. I have a job opportunity here that's really good. Do you love it? What? The job opportunity? Do you love it? Like, does it make you excited to get up in the morning and start working on it? Margaret opened her mouth to say yes, then realized she couldn't. The Hartford position was perfect on paper, but it didn't make her pulse race the way discussing educational programs with Thomas had. It didn't make her feel the way she'd felt standing in the lighthouse tower, seeing possibilities spread out like a map. It's complicated, Margaret said finally. Adults always say that when the answer is no, but they don't want to admit it. Emma's voice was gentle but direct. Margaret, I know I'm just a kid, but I've been watching my dad sacrifice what he wants for what he thinks is responsible my whole life. And I've been watching you try to talk yourself into wanting something that makes sense instead of something that makes you happy. How can you possibly know what makes me happy? We've known each other for 3 days. Because I saw you with my dad. I saw how you looked when you were helping him fix things, when you were talking about the educational programs, when you were just sitting on the front steps drinking coffee. Emma paused. You looked like you were home. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. Emma, I'm not saying you should give up your whole life for some guy you barely know. But maybe you should think about what your life could look like if you stopped being so scared of changing it. After Emma hung up, Margaret sat in her car for a long time thinking about fear and change, and the difference between being smart and being wise. Emma was right, Margaret had been scared. Scared of disrupting her carefully rebuilt life, scared of depending on someone else's happiness, for her own scared of making choices based on feelings rather than logic. But what if logic was overrated? What if the smart choice wasn't always the right choice? Margaret went upstairs to her condo and sat at her kitchen table looking at the museum contract her assistant had prepared for signature. Everything was perfect. Salary benefits, creative control, meaningful work. All she had to do was sign, and she'd have the secure, purposeful future she'd been trying to build. Instead, she found herself opening her laptop and researching something entirely different, small business loans for educational tourism ventures in Maine. 2 hours later, she had a preliminary business plan outlined and a list of resources for developing eco-educational programs. 3 hours after that, she was pricing commercial kitchen equipment for a bed and breakfast operation that could serve as base camp for island educational programs. By evening, she had the skeleton of a completely different life mapped out, one that involved taking enormous risks, leaving everything familiar behind, and betting her future on a connection she'd made during 3 extraordinary days on a remote island. It was terrifying. It was irrational. It was the opposite of everything she'd trained herself to want after Richard's death. It was also the most alive she'd felt in 5 years. Margaret picked up her phone and called her assistant. I need you to draft a response to the Hartford Museum, she said. Thank them for the opportunity, but I'm going to have to decline. Decline, Margaret. This is exactly what you said you wanted. I know, but I was wrong about what I wanted. Margaret looked around her immaculate condo, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time. I also need you to start researching what it would take to sell this place and look into Maine business licenses. Maine, Margaret, are you feeling all right? Actually, Margaret said, surprised by the truth of it, I think I'm feeling better than I have in years. That night, Margaret began making lists. Not the careful, conservative lists she'd been making for months, but wild, ambitious, terrifying lists. Lists of what she'd need to learn to build to risk. Lists of possibilities that made her heart race with excitement rather than anxiety. She was going back to the island. Not as a visitor this time, but as someone ready to build something new. Something meaningful, something that honored both her need for purpose and her growing feelings for a lighthouse keeper who'd saved her from more than just rising water. The next morning, Margaret began making calls. To her real estate agent, to her accountant, to the Coast Guard station in Maine to ask about regulations for educational boat tours. Each call felt like cutting another anchor line, freeing herself from the safe harbor of her old life to sail towards something unknown, but infinitely more promising. She was going home, to a place she'd known for only 3 days, to a man she'd met during a crisis, to a future she couldn't predict or control. She was going home, and she'd never been more terrified or more certain of anything in her life. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark water, keeping watch, guiding lost souls through the storm towards safety. And for the first time in years, Margaret Hale was ready to follow its light. Thank you so much for joining Margaret and Thomas on this journey of second chance and unexpected love. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales that prove it's never too late to start over, to find love, and to discover that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin when we least expect them. What did you think of Margaret's brave decision to leave everything behind for love and purpose? Have you ever had to choose between safety and happiness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing from you, and your stories often inspire future tales. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of love, hope, and the courage to begin again. Until next time, remember that every ending is just a new beginning waiting to unfold.